My unfaithful wife pleaded for forgiveness as I filed for divorce and executed a meticulously crafted plan for revenge. It's astonishing how drastically my life has unraveled in just 4 years. 4 years ago, my wife began working at Gilbert Endeavors. Our children were teenagers, and Sarah was eager to re-enter the workforce. At that time, an entry-level secretarial position seemed like a reasonable decision. My name is Skip Trexler, though everyone simply calls me Skip. In high school, I was a wiry guy of average height, weighing under 140 pounds. I wasn't interested in sports, but I had a passion for long-range shooting. Throughout high school and college, I spent the majority of my free time practicing shooting or reloading ammunition. After 8 years, I honed my skills to hit a 2-inch target from 100 yards away. My weapon of choice was the Marlin 393-6 Celsius, which used a .393 caliber cartridge. Although this cartridge was no longer manufactured, I made my own from .3030 shells, which brought me a significant sense of accomplishment. 2 pivotal events occurred during my college years. I met Sarah, who would become my wife, and Chuck Fuller, my future business partner. College itself, while somewhat uneventful, earned me a degree in geology. I got married and co-founded a small surveying firm with Chuck. Life was good back then. Neither of us ever worked for anyone else after graduating. We each contributed $2,500 to start our business, focusing on modest real estate projects. While the profits weren't substantial, we felt content and secure. Chuck married a local girl 3 months after Sarah and I tied the knot. My family owned a bungalow on 160 acres in Schuylkill Hill County, where we often held family gatherings during my childhood. Meanwhile, Chuck's family had a cabin on 640 acres in Potter County, which they primarily used for hunting. This background sets the stage for how everything began to fall apart 4 years ago. Gilbert Endeavors, the company Sarah joined, specializes in designing and manufacturing trainers. While their headquarters are nearby, they have plants and distribution centers nationwide. Sarah started working there when our twin daughters, Marcy and Mercy, began high school. Initially, the job seemed ideal, offering decent hours, fair pay, and a convenient location. During the first year, everything seemed perfect. However, GE later brought on Terry Ulrich, a former NFL quarterback, as their marketing manager and company spokesperson. Unfortunately, Sarah worked in the marketing department. For 6 months, our household was inundated with stories about the incredible Terry Ulrich. Both my wife and daughters were infatuated with his charm and reputation. Fortunately, their adoration began to fade after 6 months. Around that time, Sarah started working longer hours. Since Chuck and I are locals, we knew many employees at Gilbert, making it easy to discover that Sarah and Terry had become romantically involved. As their affair deepened, our marriage deteriorated, and I became increasingly estranged from my daughters. I never confronted Sarah, though I was fully aware of the situation. She began traveling frequently for business and promotional trips, leaving me feeling invisible. Occasionally, she invited me to events, only for me to be ignored the entire evening. Intimacy became non-existent. Living such a life was unbearable. Before Sarah's job at Gilbert, we had a typical family life. Weekends and vacations together, ballet and football practices, PTA meetings and scouts. We even had a weekly pizza night. The only activity the girls disliked was spending time at the bungalow. All of that is now just a memory. Over the years, Sarah's work retreats, conferences, and meetings increased. On several of her longer trips, she took our daughters with her, never asking or including me. I overheard the girls excitedly telling their friends about their experiences, though they never mentioned anything when they knew I could hear. Terry Ulrich's name was noticeably absent, though I knew he accompanied them on every trip. Everything became crystal clear at Gilbert's New Year's party. Sarah had no choice but to invite me, though I had no desire to attend. Facing her infidelity in such a public setting was humiliating, and I feared losing control if things escalated. My fears were justified. The girls were thrilled to attend their first adult party, dressed to impress. I didn't own a tuxedo, so I wore my best suit. When we arrived, hundreds of people were mingling. "Skip Trexler, good to see you. Thanks for bringing your wife and lovely daughters," Terry Ulrich said with a smile as he shook my hand firmly. Sarah smirked while my daughters glared at me with disdain before quickly walking away. The evening was off to a terrible start. I sipped a beer and retreated to a corner, trying not to embarrass my family further. Although I didn't say or do anything, I somehow managed to ruin the start of their night. Terry Ulrich was an imposing figure, at least a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier than me, all muscle. He exuded charisma and success. My daughters clung to him, while Sarah spent most of the evening by his side, lightly holding his hand. A few low-ranking employees made half-hearted attempts to engage me in conversation, while mid- and senior-level managers either smirked or made snide comments about my diminished status. I couldn't make out their words, but their actions made everything clear. My beer had been replaced with a simple ginger ale, which I sipped slowly. I usually prided myself on maintaining control and staying calm in any situation. As the dancing began, I noticed my wife and daughters enjoying themselves, with Sarah frequently staying near Ulrich. Over the next 3 hours, neither Sarah nor the girls said a word to me. On the dance floor, a small group gestured towards Sarah and Ulrich, laughing as they glanced in my direction before quickly looking away when they saw me notice them. That moment marked the end of my evening. I set my glass down, walked toward the exit, and caught sight of Ulrich with his hands on my wife's rear while she ran her fingers through his hair. Before I could process what I was seeing, she pulled his head down and kissed him deeply in the middle of the dance floor. In less than 5 seconds, I crossed the room, spun Ulrich around, and threw a hard right punch at him. Pain shot through my arm, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the back of an ambulance. The ride to the emergency room only took a few minutes, and I realized I was alone in the vehicle. I vaguely remembered being wheeled into the ER and later waking up in the recovery area. A doctor arrived about 30 minutes later to update me on my condition. Along with a broken arm, I had suffered 3 fractured ribs, a broken nose, 3 missing teeth, 2 loose ones, a jaw wired shut, and a bruised kidney. To top it off, Ulrich had landed a solid blow to my groin, damaging several blood vessels. The doctor informed me that I could leave the hospital in about 4 days, but would need at least 2 weeks in rehab. I chose to leave as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Sarah and the girls finally showed up. Sarah appeared irritated, the girls looked uninterested, and no one spoke a word. With my jaw wired shut, I hesitated to say anything, not wanting to reveal too much. Judging Sarah's demeanor, I decided a conversation wasn't necessary. Instead, I simply muttered and gestured toward my jaw. We sat in silence for about a minute before she began talking, expressing her embarrassment and explaining that the girls had felt so ashamed that they left the party before midnight. She blamed me for ruining the evening and remarked that she should have known better than to take me anywhere in public. She promised that nothing like this would happen again, though she had no idea how right she was. Unable to muster a smile, I just stared at her. With no response from me, they eventually stood and left. A few hours later, Chuck arrived. We chatted briefly, yes. I could chatter briefly, yes. I could talk despite my jaw being wired, before he handed me the local newspaper. My altercation at the New Year's Eve party had made the front page, with an article claiming I had attacked my wife. Chuck and I discussed various options for a couple of hours before he left. That night, I skipped dinner, requested sleeping pills, and aimed for a long, uninterrupted rest. The next day passed slowly, with numerous tests and assessments conducted to evaluate my injuries. Every problem was addressed, and the appropriate measures were taken. All that remained was to wait and recover. A hospital staff member provided a list of rehab centers, and I selected one near Hamburg. Chuck visited later that evening, and I decided to sell my share of the business to him for $2,500. The handshake sealed the deal, though I still considered myself a co-owner in spirit. We laughed about the irony that a week in rehab would cost the exact amount I had received from the sale. Sarah and the girls never returned to see me at the hospital, only visiting the day after I moved to the rehab facility. Annoyed that they hadn't been informed, they were furious when they were denied entry. Apparently, I had the authority to decide who could visit, and I had made my preferences clear. When the staff informed me of their attempt to see me, I couldn't help but laugh. Despite the pain it caused in my ribs, the most challenging part of my recovery was the dental work. Though the rehab center had an on-site dentist available for an extra fee, I opted to use this service. The wound on my hand, thankfully, wasn't as severe as initially feared. Although I was given the option to leave rehab early, I chose to stay for the full 2 weeks. 10 days in, I could finally breathe deeply again, which felt like a milestone. Sarah never tried to visit me again. In early February, the National CrossFit Show was held in Atlantic City, and Sarah attended with the girls, Ulrich, and the Gilbert marketing team. Meanwhile, Chuck and a few colleagues helped me move my belongings to the family bungalow in Schuylkill County. They made sure to include my Marlin rifle and reloading equipment. Within 2 days, I was settled into my new home. That weekend, Chuck and his wife June came by to visit. Sarah, apparently, had been searching for me at the office. Since there had been no deposits into our joint account since the start of the year, she wanted answers. Chuck explained that I no longer owned any part of the business and no longer worked there. Furious and desperate, she stormed out, threatening to consult a lawyer. Within weeks, I was back to normal, sticking to my physical therapy and exercise routine. Chuck left me with a company truck, a credit card, and a decent sum of cash. I handed him my phone before heading to the bungalow. It was a cozy but temporary setup. I started taking long walks and light jogs to regain fitness. Ulrich's large house on Durrier Street, just outside of town, sat along a winding road up Mount Penn, with few neighbors due to the steep terrain. It wasn't hard to locate, and I found several good secluded vantage points nearby. Each morning, I worked on getting into better shape. After lunch, I practiced target shooting, focusing on stationary objects. My Bushnell laser rangefinder confirmed I needed accuracy at 133 yards. I bought a steady supply of eggs for target practice and worked on muffling the noise. My evenings were spent refining my plans, making adjustments, and resting. I decided to grow a beard. Chuck came by every 2 weeks, while Sarah initially searched for me at the office, but gave up after 2 months. Chuck brought along newspaper articles showing my wife and daughters living extravagantly with their new patron. Sarah and the girls continued residing in our former home, which puzzled me. Realizing it was time to move forward, I began driving into town early each morning to observe Terry's house. Every day, he swam 50 laps in his heated pool, even during the winter. On weekends, I traveled to Potter County. The shift from a bungalow to a primitive hut was refreshing. No electricity, running water, or cell service. The closest Walmart was a 45-minute drive into New York, so I stocked up on supplies to last 4 months. Early one Wednesday, I transferred my belongings from the truck into my Subaru Outback. Leaving the company truck parked at a construction site, I headed to my selected vantage point. That morning, I set up a tripod, loaded a round into the chamber, and prepared 2 more. About 20 minutes later, Terry Ulrich came out for his swim. The first shot struck his right ankle, shattering it. Even with a muffler, the sound was loud in the quiet morning. 2 seconds later, his left knee was obliterated. I reloaded and fired twice more, breaking his left elbow. The final target, his right wrist, proved harder to hit due to his erratic movements. I packed up quietly, leaving the scene within 10 minutes. From the construction site, I retrieved the Subaru and headed back to Potter County, bypassing the bungalow entirely. My first task upon arrival was cleaning the water source to secure fresh drinking water. Afterward, I gathered firewood and ensured the cabin was well insulated and watertight. I replaced outdated carbon oil lamps with LED lights. Once everything was in order, I resumed shooting practice, this time using paper targets. In the middle of my second week, I spotted someone for the first time. A tall woman walking along an old logging trail with a backpack. She passed by without a word. Later, I set up a fire pit with coffee and cookies, feeling like I was laying a trap. 3 days later, it worked. She approached, introduced herself as Claire, and apologized for intruding. Expressing a desire to chat, she sat down after I offered her coffee, the best I could provide. She smiled, removed her crossbow, and took a seat. I introduced myself as Skip and explained that I had arrived in the area 2 weeks earlier. I mentioned seeing her a few times nearby and that I was staying in a lodge about a mile away. I described my routine and offered her a cookie. When I asked how long she planned to stay, she replied that she would remain through the summer. I shared my intention to stay for 4 or 5 months. She seemed to like the cookies, though I sensed she preferred her coffee with cream and sugar. Noticing her silence, I asked if she owned the property. She clarified that it belonged to a friend who let her use it. When she asked if I was hunting, I explained that I used to shoot a bit, but hadn't done so in years and was now only practicing on targets. I invited her to use the range for her bow, and though I detected a faint accent, I refrained from commenting. She accepted the offer, enjoyed another cookie, and left me with a good impression. My curiosity got the better of me, so I remarked on her recurved bow, noting that most people now use compound bows. "This one has better curvature," she replied, adding that she used lighter arrows for practice, but kept 4 hunting arrows mounted on the bow. That evening, I drove a few miles to pick up 3 bales of hay, marking the start of my summer with Claire Charles. Claire visited daily but always returned to her lodge at night. The staff tracked her movements through her cell phone, so they always knew her location. During the second week, a powerful summer storm hit. As we took shelter on the cabin porch, we laughed and joked about the situation. Without hesitation, she called her lodge and informed them she couldn't return due to the weather, adding that she had found a comfortable place to stay for the night. I was surprised and pleased. This marked the turning point in our platonic friendship, transforming it into a close bond. From then on, we alternated between sleeping at the cabin and the lodge. The Highlands Lodge felt out of place in Potter County, being both luxurious and expensive, with most of its guests coming from abroad. Claire's family hailed from Cornwall. The lodge offered hot showers, plenty of food and laundry services, which I took full advantage of. Outdoor life was enjoyable, but it was even better with those conveniences. We spent less time at the shooting range. A few weeks later, while having lunch, Chuck and his wife June arrived. June seemed especially pleased that I had company, even more so when she realized Claire and I were in a full-fledged relationship. For the first few hours, we kept things low-key, but eventually Claire and June went off to chat. Meanwhile, the aftermath of my attack on Terry Ulrich had made me the prime suspect. This development created a bigger issue for Terry than he had anticipated. The media wanted to know why I was their main focus. As they investigated, more scrutiny fell on Terry and Sarah's relationship. Within 3 weeks, Terry Ulrich was no longer the spokesperson for Gilbert Endeavors. Police searched the Schuylkill County bungalow and found it empty. They had no leads from credit cards or phone calls and no clue where I was. They never questioned Chuck about the cabin. Chuck told me Sarah had repeatedly visited the office, trying in vain to discover my location. She seemed desperate, as her financial support ran dry. According to Chuck, Terry had lost interest in Sarah and blamed her for his troubles. With no plans for the future and no other immediate goals, I felt adrift. As the year drew to a close, I noticed myself slipping into complacency. I was happy and content with Claire, but I should have paid more attention to the realities of my life. One crisp autumn day, while alone in the hut, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I had just lit the wood stove and brewed some coffee when the door suddenly flew open. Standing there was Terry Ulrich, looking just as massive and unpleasant as the last time I had seen him. He stood in the doorway, grinning broadly, with an old SWAT-issued pistol gripped in his right hand. His stance was unsteady, and his left arm hung at an odd angle, as though he was struggling to keep his balance. We stared at each other in silence. and I half expected him to deliver some menacing line about revenge, but he said nothing. "Coffee?" I offered, breaking the tension. "I spent over $10,000 tracking you down." "No, I don't want your damn coffee," he barked. "So what do you want?" I asked calmly. "I know it was you, you sneaky little weasel," he growled. "Your wife told me you were into target shooting. I hope there are good medical services around here because you're going to need them." His face turned red and swollen with anger, and he seemed to be working himself into a frenzy. Suddenly, his expression shifted. He dropped the gun and collapsed to one knee. Rolling onto the floor, he screamed in agony. A crossbow bolt protruded a full 12 inches from his left buttock, with the remaining 6 inches embedded deeply. Claire stood in the doorway, smiling as though she had just delivered a punchline. We ran nearly the entire way back to the Highlands, leaving the cabin behind without taking anything with us. Claire took just 15 minutes to load all her belongings into the rented Land Rover, and we laughed like a pair of mischievous teenagers the entire time. By the time we reached Route 80, we had calmed down. Over breakfast, I casually remarked that Terry had probably removed the arrow and gone to the hospital. However, I expressed doubt about the process, explaining that it was one of my 3-bladed hunting arrows, which couldn't simply be pulled out and would need to be cut out instead. I joked that he'd likely end up lying on his stomach on a hospital gurney, a predicament that must have been humiliating. I teased Claire, saying it was all her fault, to which she playfully flicked a forkful of scrambled eggs at me. After breakfast, I called Chuck to fill him in while Claire made a call of her own. Chuck found the story amusing, and I told him we were heading to Ocala, Florida, where my grandparents lived. He chuckled, knowing I was only saying that to throw off any potential trail. As I talked to Chuck, Claire wandered over, slipped my wallet from my pocket, and returned to her seat as though nothing had happened. She continued her call while I purchased snacks for the trip. I had no idea where we were actually going, but Claire seemed to have a plan. She kept her intentions to herself, and I didn't press her for details. I trusted her completely and enjoyed the mystery. After a long, tiring day, we found a charming bed and breakfast nestled in the valleys of Wisconsin. Exhausted from the drive, we fell asleep quickly. Luckily, breakfast the next morning was fantastic, and 4 hours later, we arrived at a Walmart in Duluth. Claire had all her belongings, while I left with nothing. She seemed to enjoy keeping me in the dark, clearly having fun with the situation. I purchased a new set of clothes, and Claire picked up a large bag of snacks. Since childhood, I dreamed of canoeing on lakes, and now I was finally living that dream. Before we departed, I made one last call to Chuck, and the outfitter had already been considered to buy the car, which hinted that we wouldn't be coming back. The whole thing felt both mysterious and exhilarating. He updated me on Terry's latest failure, which had become a major news story, even covered by national outlets. In the background, I could hear June's laughter. Chuck told me that Terry's reputation was in shambles and that everything he touched seemed to go wrong. Chuck relished the irony, saying Terry deserved every bit of it. He also mentioned that Sarah was struggling financially and emotionally after the divorce, which had apparently hit her hard. Surprised, I told Chuck I hadn't hired a lawyer or filed for divorce. Chuck insisted, saying Sarah had ranted about it at the office earlier that day. He then asked if I could pick up his belongings and car from the cottage, as he was in Moss Bluff, Florida, searching for a rental trailer. Meanwhile, Claire waved to me from the dock, where a loaded canoe awaited. Thankfully, my Boy Scout camp experience prevented me from feeling completely inept in the canoe. We spent the next 6 days exploring the lakes, camping out each night. Claire used her phone's GPS to navigate effortlessly, and I thoroughly enjoyed the adventure, especially the starlit nights that brought us closer together. At noon on the final day, a man met us at a remote pier along a quiet road. He embraced Claire, and the two conversed in French. After about 30 minutes, he handed her a set of truck keys and a large envelope. We unloaded the canoe and hit the road, and as I glanced back, I saw him pushing off from the dock. I never heard from Sarah or the girls again. Each Christmas, Chuck and June received mysterious cards signed by Mr. and Mrs. Clinton Barfield. This year, the card will include a photo of us with our 3 children. I'm sure Chuck will figure it out.